Haakon Magnusson did not fall in battle. He did not charge into enemy lines, nor did he die with a sword in hand or a crown on his head. He died in silence. In the bitter cold of Norway's Dovre Mountains, the last Viking prince collapsed into the snow, not from wounds or war, but from something darker, colder: betrayal. His own nobles, the very men who once lifted him onto the throne, stood around him with quiet eyes and colder hearts. No trumpet sounded, no blade clashed, only whispers cutting deeper than any axe, until one of them stepped forward and took his head. The last Viking to wear a crown didn't die facing his enemies. He died surrounded by cowards in a world that had outgrown him, and no one wept. His death wasn't just the end of a man, it was the death rattle of an era. A time when kings raided by sea and ruled by might, when crowns were forged from blood and iron, not ink and compromise. Haakon tried to bring that world back, but Norway had changed. The nobles no longer wanted a warrior, they wanted a clerk, a ruler who bowed to the church, paid his debts, and knew how to kneel. Haakon refused, so they buried him, first with silence, then with snow, and finally with a sword. But before that frozen death, there was a boy. Not a monster, not yet a king, just a child born in the long shadow of a fallen god. His name was Haakon, and his bloodline was cursed the moment it began. He was born into a bloodline that could drown a kingdom, grandson of Harald Hardrada, son of Magnus II, heir to a legacy carved in steel and scorched into the memory of Europe. But Haakon Magnusson was not born on a battlefield. He was born into silence. By the time he opened his eyes, his grandfather had already died in defeat, hacked down at Stamford Bridge by a foreign king, and the great Viking roar had turned into a distant echo. All that remained was the weight of expectation and the smell of fading glory. They named him Haakon, like the kings of old, but it was a name soaked in ghosts. From the moment he could walk, every eye in the room studied him not as a boy, but as a relic. Not a future, but a remainder. The world he was meant to rule no longer existed. The longboats had rotted. The berserkers were gone. The gods had fallen silent, but in his veins ran the same fire that once burned cities. And fire without direction, it consumes the one who carries it. He was passed from hand to hand like a ceremonial dagger, too valuable to discard, too dangerous to wield. His mother faded into obscurity. His father died too soon. And so Haakon became a vessel molded not by love, but by ambition. The man who raised him, Stegathoria, was not a father. He was a weaponsmith, and Haakon was the blade. And like any weapon, the boy never truly belonged to himself. Even as a child, Haakon stared too long at fire. He listened too closely to silence. He did not cry when others cried, and when he smiled, it never reached his eyes. The nobles called him reserved, but the servants whispered something else. He has his grandfather's stare, the kind that doesn't see people, only threats or prey. He grew up without comfort, without softness, without warmth. No lullabies, no confessions, no tears. Just legacy, duty, and the endless pressure of living in a world that had already decided what kind of king he must become. And in that pressure, something inside him began to crack, not loudly, not all at once, but slow and quiet and permanent. By the time Olaf Kyr's peaceful rule began to die, Haakon was already too twisted to bend. He did not want to inherit the new Norway. He wanted to resurrect the old one. And in his eyes, the man who would shape him, the one who fed him on dreams of revolt, was the only soul in the kingdom who truly understood what had to be done. His name was Stegathoria, and in the shadows, he was already building a crown out of treason. Stegathoria never raised a child, he raised a weapon, and Haakon Magnusson was his sharpest creation. While other boys learned to pray and read scripture, Haakon learned how to read men, their eyes, their silences, their weaknesses. Thoria didn't teach him how to love his people. He taught him how to distrust them, how to rule them through fear, through pride, through blood if needed. Because Thoria was not a nobleman in the traditional sense, he was a relic, a holdover from a time when power came from the axe, not from parchment. And in Haakon, he saw the perfect vessel for vengeance, not against a man, but against time itself. Thoria had once stood beside kings, bled in the snow with berserkers, and watched as the new court, the polished, Christianized southern court, pushed his kind into shadow. He had survived, but he hadn't forgiven. In Haakon, he whispered the old names, the old codes, the old gods, even as the priests tightened their grip on the realm. The boy grew up sleeping beneath wolf pelts, not crosses. He was never taught mercy, only strength. And beneath it all, one lesson echoed louder than any: the new world is weak, and weak things rot. The twist was, Thoria didn't just want a king, he wanted a mirror. A boy who hated softness as much as he did, but even he couldn't see the sickness curling beneath the surface. Haakon didn't just reject the new Norway, he despised it. The courtiers with their polished Latin, the bishops with their gold rings, the treaties, the order, the compromises. He didn't want to rule that world. He wanted to burn it. And as the boy grew into a young man, Thoria fed him names. The names of nobles who had betrayed the old ways. Names of lands that should belong to him. Names of men who would one day kneel or blade. Haakon listened. He remembered. He sharpened. But the tragedy neither of them saw was this: by forging a blade too early, Thoria had made it unstable. The boy was king in waiting, but never learned patience. He had a crown in his dreams, but no throne beneath him. Only hunger. Only rage. And when peace finally cracked in the south, and the king who kept the realm quiet took his last breath, Haakon was already ready, too ready, and the nobles of the north, they would answer his call, for now. When King Olaf Kyrd died in the autumn of 1093, the peace he had spent 2 decades forging cracked like ice underfoot. No one cried, no one cheered. They simply waited, eyes turning north and south, as if expecting thunder. And it came, but not in a roar. It came in silence. 2 names emerged from the cold, each claiming the same blood, the same right, the same crown. Magnus Barefoot, son of Olaf, already crowned in the southern town of Viking. And Haakon Magnusson, the northern wolf, crowned by old hands in Trondheim. It wasn't a civil war, not yet. It was something more dangerous, a kingdom torn not by sword, but by memory. Half the realm still remembered raiding and roaring and gods with hammer-shaped names. The other half had moved on, built churches, minted coins, signed treaties. One side belonged to the past, the other to the future. Haakon didn't just represent a man, he represented everything Norway used to be, and to the north, that still meant something. Thoria moved quickly, draping Haakon in a crown of iron and ambition. The northern nobles, many of them aging warriors, tired of kneeling to bishops, swore their oaths. They whispered that Haakon would bring the storm back, that the time of softness was ending, that war would cleanse the land again, but oaths made in frost often melt in fire. And Haakon, for all his bloodline, had never led an army, never ruled a village, let alone a kingdom. What he had was lineage. What he lacked was loyalty. Magnus, meanwhile, did not panic. He didn't rush north. He didn't flinch. Because he knew something Haakon didn't. The heart of a kingdom isn't held by warriors. It's held by those who feed them, clothe them, pay them. The south had gold, ports, and priests. The north had wolves, and wolves don't build thrones, they circle them. Haakon stood tall in Trondheim, yes, but the ground beneath him was already shifting. His title was king. But his crown had no weight, not yet, and the man who would try to change that was still clinging to the ghosts of a time that no longer feared him. He would not adapt, he would not bow, he would not wait, he would move. And when he did, Norway would remember what a Viking king looked like, even if it was the last time they ever did. He refused the robes, he refused the rituals. While Magnus wore velvet and kissed rings, Haakon rode bare-chested through the frost-bitten pines of Trondelag, wrapped in wolf fur and silence. He didn't rule like a king. He hunted like an animal, no sermons, no counsels, no coins stamped with his name, only eyes that watched from the dark and a presence that pulled fear out of men like marrow from bone. He was not a reformer, he was a resurrection. A ghost walking in flesh, dragging the sagas of his ancestors behind him like chains. Haakon didn't hold court, he held feasts, where the meat bled and the ale overflowed, and warriors pounded tables while speaking of fire and blood. He called it loyalty, others called it madness. When the bishops came to bless his crown, he sent them away. When the scribes offered to record his laws, he burned the parchment. "What law do I need?" he whispered once, "but the strength of my own hand." But beneath that strength, something was unraveling. Haakon wasn't building a kingdom, he was building a myth. One based not on stone or scripture, but on fear, fire, and frost. His northern lords clapped their mugs and swore fealty with wine on their breath. But at night, they asked themselves how long they'd survive if he ever turned on them. Because Haakon didn't trust men, he didn't negotiate, he didn't forgive. And as the weeks passed, the fires in his eyes grew darker, colder, less human. He believed he was born in the wrong time, that he had been cursed to wear a crown in an age of weakness, and he made it his mission to break that age. His envoys carried not treaties, but ultimatums. His messengers brought not gifts, but warnings, either kneel or fall. But in the south, Magnus did not kneel, he did not even move. He simply waited, sharpening his crown in quiet, feeding his own wolves of a different breed. And while Haakon roared through the forests, Magnus whispered through the walls. One of them ruled with steel, the other with silence, and in the end, it would be silence that proved sharper. Magnus Barefoot didn't need to shout. He let the kingdom do that for him. While Haakon howled like a dying age, Magnus moved like a tide, silent, calculated, inevitable. To the outside world, he was the son of Olaf Kyr, a man of church and peace. But behind the veil of civility was a mind colder than any winter in the north. Magnus had learned young that power wasn't in the blade, it was in the pause before it fell. And unlike Haakon, he had no need to be feared. He only needed to be obeyed. Where Haakon built bonfires of loyalty, Magnus planted roots, deep, political, poisonous. He dined with bishops, whispered to merchants, made pacts with nobles who preferred gold to blood. Every man Haakon tried to intimidate, Magnus bought. Every threat Haakon issued, Magnus buried under favors and quiet smiles. He didn't need to declare war. He made Haakon look like one, and in a kingdom that had grown tired of fire, that was enough. Magnus knew that time was on his side. The longer Haakon ruled like a Viking, the more the nobles squirmed. The more priests recoiled. The more silence began to grow behind the feasting halls. Even Haakon's own followers started asking unspoken questions. Is this king building a future or dragging us into a grave? And Magnus fed that doubt like oil into a slow fire. But it wasn't just politics. Magnus understood the deeper rot. He knew Haakon wasn't just a rival. He was a relic driven by a man who had raised him for rebellion, not for rule. And if Haakon's heart was a furnace, then Stega Thoria was the coal. So Magnus didn't strike at Haakon first. He struck at the loyalties around him. He opened backdoor channels, sent messengers into the dark, offered deals to men who once swore blood oaths to the north. And slowly, the ice began to crack under Haakon's feet, though he didn't hear it yet. He believed the throne was his by blood. Magnus knew it would be his by patience. And so while Haakon marched, howled and burned, Magnus watched. Quiet. Waiting, letting the north exhaust itself. Because the crown wouldn't be won in battle. It would be taken in the stillness that follows. And when Haakon finally marched south to claim what he thought was already his, the trap had already begun to close, in silence, under snow. He marched into the mountains not as a king, but as a shadow chasing a throne. Haakon Magnusson left Trondheim in the dead of winter, leading his men south through the icy ridges of Dovrefjell, not with banners, but with hunger in their eyes and cold biting their backs. He believed he was descending to take what was his. In truth, he was walking straight into a kingdom that had already decided it would never be his. The snow didn't come gently, it howled, it blinded, it carved into flesh like knives. His warriors, once drunk on oaths and feasts, now tightened their cloaks in silence, their eyes hollowed by frostbite and doubt. Rations thinned, horses slipped on ice, fires died faster than they could be lit. And yet Haakon pressed forward, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on a crown that shimmered only in memory. He didn't see the exhaustion behind him, or worse, he saw it and didn't care. He spoke of reclaiming honor, of restoring a true king to a broken land. But in their hearts, the men around him began to ask darker questions. Why were they freezing for a war no one had declared? Why were they following a king who spoke to ghosts, not gods? And whose crown were they really carrying, Haakon's or Stega Thoria's? The whispers began quietly, around the fires, beneath the cloaks, while Haakon slept. Men who had sworn blood oaths now sharpened doubt instead of blades. Some began to dream of Magnus, not with love but with relief, because Magnus offered structure, roads, law, food. Haakon offered only frost and fury. Still Haakon didn't waver, his feet cracked ice. His eyes burned through fog. He believed every hardship made him more worthy, that every man who dropped behind was dead weight. but he wasn't leading an army anymore. He was dragging ghosts through a graveyard of snow. By the time they reached the midpoint of the range, the silence was complete. No songs, no laughter, just breathing, shallow and brittle. And somewhere in that stillness, something broke, not in the mountains, but in the loyalty that had once held his world together. Men don't always turn with swords. Sometimes they just stop walking. And behind Haakon's back, they had already started to choose. Loyalty doesn't shatter in battle, it erodes in silence. And in the frozen stillness of Dovreftgel, Haakon Magnusson became a king without followers, a flame without warmth. The men around him no longer saw a warrior, they saw a weight. The crown he wore in his mind had become invisible to the rest, buried beneath hunger, cold, and fear. But worse than all of that was what came next. The whispers. They didn't speak openly. They didn't need to. A glance was enough. A shared silence around the fire. A sudden quiet when Haakon passed. One by one, the men who once roared for his cause began to tilt their heads toward the south, toward Magnus, toward something, anything, that wasn't this. It wasn't just the snow that made them tremble. It was the realization that their king was no longer leading them forward. He was dragging them down with him, and then came the offers. They didn't come with banners or soldiers. They came in the form of soft voices slipping through the cracks, messengers without names, promises without paper, gold, titles, land, a place in the new order. All they had to do was let the frost finish what Magnus had already begun. No blood, no screams, just one moment of stillness, one nod, one man alone. The nobles who had lifted Haakon onto the throne now weighed his life like a stone in the hand. He had no heirs, no alliance, no favor from the church. His presence was more dangerous than his absence. And most of all, they feared what he might become if he reached the southern court. Because a cornered Viking does not negotiate, he destroys. So before he reached the gates, they decided he never would. Some say it was Thorir who first sensed the fracture, that he warned Haakon, begged him to turn back. Others say Thorir knew and kept walking anyway, blinded by pride. But the truth is colder than either tale. It didn't matter who knew. The decision had already been made. Haakon's death wouldn't come by blade, it would come by stillness. By men who once followed him choosing not to raise their hands when the time came to watch his head fall. And that time was closer than he thought. He didn't scream, he didn't fight. When Haakon Magnusson collapsed in the snow at Dovreftgel, there were no swords drawn, no arrows loosed, no blood yet spilled. Just the sound of breath freezing in the air and boots crunching closer through frost. Some say he fell from illness. Others say it was poison slipped into his rations by hands that once toasted his name. But whatever killed him, it wasn't war, it was abandonment. The moment came quietly. He sank to his knees, eyes glazed not from pain, but from the realization that no one moved to help him. No arms reached out. No voices cried. The men who once called him king stood still, silent, staring as if the mountain itself had claimed him. And in a way it had, because he no longer belonged to the living, not in their minds, not in their loyalties, not in their future. Then someone stepped forward. Not with a cry of rebellion, not with a curse. Just a glance, a nod, and a blade drawn with the same calm as slicing bread. They didn't behead him because they hated him. They did it because it was easier than letting him rise again. Because in that moment, Haakon wasn't a man. He was a risk, a memory, a fragment of an age that had already rotted, still clinging to breath. And they buried that age with one clean cut. No songs were sung, no cairn was built. They left his body in the cold, crownless, lifeless, faceless. The last Viking prince died not with thunder, but with a silence so deep it swallowed the wind. And as the men turned back down the mountain, they didn't speak of what they'd done, because there was nothing to say. They had followed him into the dark. And when the dark turned on them, they chose the world instead. But not all debts vanish with death. There was still one man who had walked beside Haakon from the beginning, the one who had made him, fed him, shaped him. And he would not be spared. They didn't need a trial, they needed a symbol. Stega Thoria, mentor kingmaker, the man who forged Haakon from the bones of an old world, was seized before the snow around Haakon's body had even melted. The nobles who once drank from his cups now dragged him in chains through streets he had once ruled in whispers. They didn't call it revenge, they called it balance. His execution was not quiet, it was staged, public, intentional. A breaking of the spine that had held the North together. The crowd did not weep, they watched. Cold faces, colder hearts, because Thoria wasn't just a man. He was the last architect of rebellion, the last voice of the age that died on Dovrefjell. And his death wasn't justice. It was a warning. They bound his arms, forced him to his knees, and as the axe was lifted, he didn't beg, he didn't flinch. Some say he smiled. Others say he stared straight ahead, not at the crowd, but beyond them, into the dark, into something only he could still see. The face of a boy he raised like a weapon, now lost to snow. The axe fell once, then again. They made sure the head was separated, clean, visible, because Magnus didn't want to kill a man, he wanted to erase a memory. Thoria's body was discarded like a warning etched into the earth. This is what happens to the old world when it refuses to die. And with his death, no noble in Norway ever again whispered the name Haakon with pride. It became a silence, a closed book, a frozen grave in a forest no one marked. But not all endings burn, some simply vanish. And in the stillness left behind, Magnus barefoot would rise, not as a rival, but as the only name left standing. The kingdom did not tremble when Haakon died, it exhaled. With his body buried under frost and Thoria's head laid in the snow like a discarded relic, Magnus barefoot stood alone. No rival, no noise, no resistance. He didn't take the throne by force, he inherited it from silence. And in that silence, he built something colder than war, control. Magnus didn't celebrate, he reorganized. Territories were redrawn, alliances reforged, northern nobles quietly replaced or rewarded, depending on how cleanly they had let Haakon fall. The church smiled, the coin flowed, the southern ports hummed again. Norway didn't just return to order, it forgot what chaos had looked like, but something darker settled beneath that peace. The Viking spirit, untamed, brutal, uncontrollable, was gone, not buried with honor, not burned with songs. It was erased, like blood scrubbed from stone. Magnus ruled not as a warrior, but as a king shaped by patience, silence, and shadows. He did not fear rebellion. He had already watched a generation of rebels betray their own. Haakon Magnusson's name was not outlawed, it simply wasn't spoken. No sagas were written for him, no hall bore his image. The boy who once carried the legacy of Harald Hardrada died without a legacy of his own. And as the years passed, even his killers forgot the color of his eyes. But the snow remembers, the mountains remember. Somewhere in the frost-bitten silence of Dovrefjell, the wind still carries the weight of a crown that never fit, and a death that came not from enemies, but from brothers. And in that cold, Magnus's victory began to feel less like a triumph, and more like the quiet, hollow coronation of a world that no longer had a soul. Haakon Magnusson was never meant to rule the world he was born into. He was built for one that no longer existed. His crown was forged in memory, sharpened by vengeance, and buried in snow by the very hands that once lifted it. No foreign army took him, no battlefield claimed him. He was undone by silence, cold, and men too afraid to follow him any further. His story ends not with glory, but with forgetting. But the blood that ran through him did not begin with him. It came from Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king who fell at Stamford Bridge, and the man who struck him down, Harold Godwinson, who would himself fall just weeks later. These men were not just kings, they were carved into the bones of Europe. If you want to witness the brutal fall of Harald Hardrada, the warrior king who bled like a god, or the crushing fate of Harold Godwinson, the victor who lost everything, both stories wait for you. And if this is your first time here, this channel tells the stories others bury. The broken thrones, the severed bloodlines, the cold truths behind royal crowns. Subscribe and don't look away, because the next fall is coming.